Last week we saw the children of Israel, or as the text says, the testimony of the children of Israel, that they left Elam and went into the wilderness of Sin. Well, this jogs your memories from last week. It's at this point that Israel runs out of food and is becoming hungry. However, rather than turning to Jehovah to ask him to help, they instead murmur. They complain. They complain against Moses and they complain against Aaron. They insist that life was better in Egypt, where they had plenty of meat and bread to eat. And then Moses and Aaron took Israel into the wilderness to kill them for dying of hunger. Now Jehovah at this point tells Moses that he's going to provide Israel the daily amount of bread that will rain down from heaven. This would happen every day except for the sixth day, which God would provide twice as much. Several times in the narrative last week, we saw how Jehovah makes it clear that he has heard their complaining, that he's heard their murmuring. That even though they murmured, Jehovah is going to provide a miracle of provision. Jehovah then tells Moses he wanted Israel to draw near to him because he heard their complaining. Israel responds by turning towards the wilderness, where the pillar of cloud was. And as they turn, and when they turn, Jehovah shows forth his glory in the cloud. Jehovah then declares what we read in verse 12. Take a look at Exodus 16:12, where it says there, I have heard the murmurings of the children of Israel. Speak unto them, saying, At even you shall eat flesh, and in the morning you shall be filled with bread, and you shall know that I am the Lord your God. So be clear that when these miracles come to pass, that it'll be Jehovah that gets the credit, that Jehovah gets the glory for it. And this is where we left off last week. Today we'll see the miracles manifest. An additional instruction provided that will further provide proof if Israel is interested in following the Torah of God's instructions or not. Now, of course, through this, we'll see disobedience among the people. Jehovah gives clear instruction, but it seems there's always individuals that either do not believe or do not take him seriously. Let's go ahead and let's ask the Lord to bless our efforts again today. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the book of Exodus. Thank you for the things we've learned thus far. And Father, we look forward to the additional truths that you lay before us. Father, I pray that as we go through this passage in Exodus 16, that you give us understanding, especially as we have an account that you refer to as showing forth your glory. Father, we're thankful for your provision you provided your people here in Exodus. Father, realizing that this teaches deeper truths, not only that you are our provider on a regular basis, that we need to seek and look for you, but Father, also as we will find here today in Deuteronomy chapter 8, that this is meant to teach your people that they are to seek you daily to find spiritual nourishment as well. Father, we're so thankful for the provisions that you give us every single day. Father, I pray we don't get weary of them, that instead we anticipate them and seek them out. Father, I pray that you're glorified in all things. I pray you give us this ability to understand the text here today, and I pray all this in Yeshua's name. Amen. All right, verse 13, start off there. And it says, And it came to pass that at even the quails came up and covered the camp, and in the morning the dew lay round about the host. Now remember that Moses had declared back in verse 8 that this would come to pass. So take a look back in verse 8. So Moses said, This shall be when the Lord shall give you in the evening flesh to eat, and in the morning bread to the full. For the Lord heareth your murmurings, which ye murmur against him. And what are we? Your murmurings are not against us, but against the Lord. So he had said back in verse 8 that there would be flesh in the evening, or meat. It says here, flesh to eat in the evening, and in the morning bread to the full. And then we also saw in verse 12, look at that again. It says, this is what Jehovah declared to Moses, Speak and say unto them, At even ye shall eat flesh, and in the morning ye shall be filled with bread, and ye shall know that I am the Lord your God. So Jehovah declared that there would be flesh in the evening. So flesh has the idea of meat, that we would use that word meat today in our language. Realize that a lot of times when you see the word meat in the Bible, it's actually just referring to the food in general, but that's why we see the word flesh. So it's clear from verse 13 that this flesh was referring to quail. So quail is a mid-sized bird. It's not like a small bird, but I don't know, like a mid-sized bird, not super large. but not super small either. So there's enough meat on there to provide for those that are looking for flesh to eat. So we see here that Jehovah caused a large amount of quails to come up on the camp of Israel. Now we know that the manna that we read about is provided to Israel 6 days a week. So we know that from the text. But there's nothing said about the quail. Now some of us suppose the quail was also provided daily, but in the evening. However, quail are not mentioned again in the text until we get to Numbers chapter 11. So some of you maybe know the Old Testament and know the Torah, know the passage about the quail, when God gives them the quail to they murmur, and then he fills them up basically 2 cubits high. And so there's basically, I think, 3 feet or so of quail deep all around them for a day's journey out. And basically that causes a plague to happen. And so we don't see quail mentioned again until Numbers 11. And it is there that we read some verses that clarify some stuff as well. So if you want to go back to Numbers, go forward to Numbers chapter 11. I'm not going to read the passage about the quail, but the passage that leads up to that portion is instructive. In Numbers chapter 11, pick it up in verse 4. So Numbers chapter 11 and verse 4, it says, "The mixed multitude that was among them fell a-lusting, and the children of Israel also wept again and said, Who shall give us flesh to eat?" So in other words, this is implying they don't have flesh to eat, and they haven't eaten it for quite a while. It says, "We remember the fish which we did eat in Egypt freely, the cucumbers and the melons and the leeks and the onions and the garlic. But now our soul is dried away, for there is nothing at all besides this manna before our eyes. And the manna was as coriander seed, and the color thereof was as the color of bdellium. And the people went about and gathered it and ground it in mills and beat it in a mortar and baked it in pans and made cakes of it. And the taste of it was as of the taste of fresh oil. And when the dew fell upon the camp at night, the manna fell upon it." So here we see reference to the manna. And what is clear is that Israel is murmuring because all they have to eat is manna. So it's clear, I think, you put the passage together. I'm not sure why some individuals think that the quail was provided every single evening. So we do see the reference to a rate every day, but that is connected to the bread being provided. And so when you read through the text carefully, that's what you see, and the Numbers 11 clarifies. So the quail was only a one-time event recorded in Exodus 16, at least until you get to Numbers 11. Now the next time that Jehovah provides a quail in Numbers 11 is connected with his judgment upon them. And so we see a great number of people die related to the plague that goes forth from their lust and their greed. Now no doubt in Exodus 16, the quail were a wonderful sight to Israel. If you're hungry and you hadn't had anything to eat quite a while, and you have all these birds that you can now eat flesh, it was probably a great meal. And so it's probably a wonderful sight for Israel to see and to be provided that way. They were very hungry, and this meal would clearly satisfy in that regard. Now it's curious why the quail was provided this one time like this. Although the text does not specifically say, I lean towards how this was so the manna was approached in a different manner. So remember, so the people are hungry all over the board, like super hungry, like starving. And then God provides this quail in the evening, so it's like this hunger that is satisfied, at least initially, as far as at least the starvation type of hunger type of stuff. And then it lays the groundwork for the ability for the next day for the manna to be provided. And it's almost like it takes the hunger edge off and allows them to process what they're eating and what they've been provided. And so that when the manna appears the next morning, they're not starving, but rather can enjoy and contemplate the manna for what it was, bread from heaven. Again, let's keep in mind that the quail and the manna are separated in importance and in status. So the text does this. So first, remember that when Jehovah told Moses he was going to provide for them, he only referred to the manna in verses 4 and 5. So go back to verse 4. So after we have the people murmuring in verse 3, and talk about how Moses and Aaron brought them in the wilderness to kill them with hunger, it says in verse 4, "Then said the Lord unto Moses, Behold, I will rain bread from heaven for you, And the people shall go out and gather a certain rate every day, that I may prove them whether they will walk in my law or no. This is connected to the manna. This is called bread from heaven, not the quail. And it shall come to pass that on the 6th day they shall prepare that which they bring in, and it shall be twice as much as they gather daily. And so when Jehovah first responds and tells Moses, he doesn't tell them about the quail, he just only tells them, at least what's emphasized in the text here, about the bread from heaven. Second of all, remember that the glory of Jehovah is connected to the manna and not the quail. So if you keep reading here and take a look at verses 6 and 7, when Moses and Aaron declare unto the people, it says, And Moses and Aaron said unto all the children of Israel, At even, then ye shall know that the Lord hath brought you out from the land of Egypt. So what they see in even, which would be the quail, will help them understand that Jehovah brought them here, and it's he that provides for them. He didn't provide for them to starve, but rather to be provided for. And then verse 7, it says, And in the morning, then ye shall see the glory of the Lord, for he heareth your murmurings against the Lord, and what are we that ye murmur against us? So they would see the glory of Jehovah connected to the provision that's provided in the morning. Now remember the sequence of events. And so the people complain to Moses. Jehovah tells Moses. Moses declares to the people what God is going to do for them. And then God declares to Moses, tell the people that they need to turn to him, look to him, they are to come near to him because he's heard their murmurings. This is still before the quail is provided. And then they turn to the wilderness and see the pillar of cloud, and God then shows his glory in the cloud. The morning hasn't come yet, so that's separate. And so we have two different events here where Jehovah shows his glory. One is clearly in the cloud, where it must have been illuminated of some sort. And then we're going to see the glory of the Lord is declared here in verse 7. Again, verse 7 says, And in the morning then ye shall see the glory of the Lord. And so it's connected with the giving of the manna, is connected with seeing the glory of Jehovah. And so when you start looking at the quail versus the manna, they're distinct. They're distinct in what God is trying to accomplish and what God is trying to show. And so it's important not to mesh the two together. So the quail is a miraculous thing. The quail does provide for God's people, but it's not meant to show the glory of God. There's something special there about the manna. That's what I want us to understand. But the quail does provide for the people. And so this is not to take away from the significance of the quail, but we need to be careful to see the distinction between the quail and the manna. The last part of verse 13 then lays the beginnings of the provision of the manna. So again, back to verse 13. It says, And it came to pass that at even the quails came up and covered the camp. So what's implied there is that people then ate the quail. I don't think they just looked at them. It says, In the morning the dew lay round about the house. So the last part of here lays the groundwork for the provision of the manna. It's clear that Jehovah used the dew as a vehicle of sorts to deliver the manna. So again, they have the quail at night, and then it says here, verse 13, it says, And in the morning the dew lay round about the host. And so we know from Numbers 11, it talks about the dew coming at nighttime. And so we see here, so they saw it in the morning, saw the dew on the ground. Moving on to verse 14. And when the dew that lay was gone up, behold, upon the face of the wilderness there lay a small round thing, as small as the hoarfrost on the ground. So most of us here understand and experienced how dew works. That in the morning when you get up, if you walk on the grass, you're going to find that you have wet shoes. So most of us in the summertime, you experience that. Not every day, but a lot. It's pretty common in the morning to have dew on the grass. Your shoes will get wet from that. But after a period of time, after the sun comes up, the dew evaporates back up into the air. So most of us, I think, understand this concept. And what is left behind? Dry ground. Now, but before Israel here, after the dew was gone up, according to verse 14, in its place was something else on the ground. It's described as a small round thing in the text. It says as small as the hoarfrost on the ground. Now, hoarfrost is a feathery frost that forms on objects when water vapor freezes. So like you have dew, rather than the dew in the air, it kind of freezes on stuff. And we see this occasionally. It's when things are covered in a pretty white crystal appearance, sometimes on leaves or grass, this sort of thing. So, trying to help us out here a little bit. So here's some pictures of what hoarfrost look like. So I think that first picture in the upper left there on the trees, I think most of us have seen those kind of pictures of where you look outside and you're like, oh, isn't that super pretty outside? You know, the trees are covered. Sometimes there might be leaves. Sometimes the grass is still out. It's not covered in snow. You get this thing called the hoarfrost. And so it's like a super, maybe it's like a foggy evening or some sort of type of thing, and the water vapor freezes the trees. And so it's a gorgeous sight. So this is hoarfrost. And so in verse 14, it says here, when the dew that lay was gone up, behold, upon the face of the wilderness there lay a small round thing, as small as the hoarfrost on the ground. So it's kind of this picture of hoarfrost. And so this kind of gives the idea of it kind of looks like this feathery type thing. And so this is not referring to frost, but from frost has thickness to it, and almost like a texture associated to it as well. Now, according to verse 31, if you go down in our chapter 16 here, we also see a little bit of more aspect to it. It says, and the house of Israel called the name thereof Manna, and it was like coriander seed, white, and the taste of it was like wafers made with honey. And we also saw in Numbers 11 that it also tastes like fresh oil. So we'll deal with this a little more with the taste and stuff when we get this verse here. We're not going to get this far today. But we see it was white and was like coriander seed. And the coriander seed does anybody know what coriander seed is? You do. What is it? It's disgusting. It's disgusting. I don't know if it's cumin. I don't think so. Coriander is different. Coriander is the dried fruit of the cilantro plant. So here's a picture here. You can see cilantro next to the coriander in the bowl, so it kind of gives you some reference. Most of us know how big, how large cilantro leaves are. And there you can see it in the bowl right next to it. And then the picture to the right gives a little bit of zoomed in picture of coriander seed. So, so you put the pieces together. So again, back in Exodus 16:31, it says, and it was like coriander seed, white, and the taste of it was like wafers made with honey. So it must have been like almost like a seed type of thing, but it was like spread upon the ground like hoarfrost at the same time. So like the dew left. So the dew was like this vehicle that God delivered. So again, he calls it bread from heaven. So this means that God delivered this manna from heaven via the dew that came down from the air. It landed on the ground, and then when the dew came up, was lifted, the manna was left on the ground, and it looked like hoarfrost. So basically covered or coated the ground in a pretty thick manner. And when you went up to it and picked it up or gathered it together, it was kind of almost like coriander seed. So that's what, it kind of put the pieces together. That's how I kind of gather it all up. Now, it says here in Exodus 16:31 that it was white. In Numbers 11:7, it says the color thereof was the color of bdellium, which bdellium is a yellowish gum resin. So I'm not sure if what that means is that if it was on the ground, it was white, but then when you like ground it up and stuff like that, maybe it cooked or whatever and turned into a yellowish color. I'm not sure, like an off-white or something like that maybe, or maybe vice versa. I don't know. Maybe it was yellowish on the ground and white when you ground it up in powder and cooked it. I don't know, one or the other. Either way, I don't think the text is wrong or conflicting. It was like a lot of other foods. The color sometimes changes when you interact with it. So that's the reality what we have here. So perspective for you. So we see here again in Exodus 16:14, and when the dew that lay was gone up, behold, upon the face of the wilderness there lay a small round thing as small as the hoarfrost on the ground. So it says in the face of the wilderness. In other words, it covered the entire ground. So as far as you look, this is what you saw. And so this was God providing for his people. Now you might say, well, that's a lot of stuff. Remember, there's a lot of people, 2 to 3 million people. On top of that, you have the animals to feed. So this stuff would have provided for the people in their food. Verse 15. It says, and when the children of Israel saw it, they said one to another, it is manna. For they wist, which is another word for knew, they knew not what it was. And Moses said unto them, this is the bread which the Lord hath given you to eat. And so again, back to verse 4, it says, then said the Lord unto Moses, behold, I will rain bread from heaven for you. So this is the result of God raining bread from heaven for them. And so it says here in verse 15, the children of Israel saw it, and they said one to another, it is manna. And they called it manna because they didn't know what it was. Now, the word manna literally means, it's a compound word which means what and the word it. So basically, what is it? So they called it what is it, or manna. So Moses then replies to them, this is the bread provided by Jehovah. This is the bread that he promised to give you, that rained down from heaven. Now, according to Numbers 11:8, you don't need to turn it there. It says that they ground it in mills, or they would beat it in a mortar. They baked it in pans, and they made cakes out of it. In other words, they were able to eat it as it was, or they could make bread out of it, or a bread-like substance out of it, or a cake-like substance out of it. And so they were able to put variety into how they ate it and used it and such. And so people said, what is it? In other words, this was a special thing that nobody's ever seen before. And so this is an unusual thing. Now keep in mind, there's lots of people, I would say unbelieving individuals, that would try to use naturalistic means to try to explain what this was. You know, there's different theories. But keep in mind again, this had to feed 2 to 3 million people on a daily basis. And this is clearly a miracle. This was not some sort of natural phenomenon that God just leveraged. So some people claim it was connected to some sap that comes out of trees and crystallizes or whatever it is. That's a lot of trees that didn't exist in the wilderness. Over a 40-year period, everywhere they went, they had it all over the ground and stuff like that. So, yeah, out of a tree, exactly. So the reality is you have to totally spiritualize everything, allegorize everything in the text to try to make it into some sort of natural phenomena, but even that doesn't make any sense. This is clearly a miracle that in a substance that no one saw before. It is brand new, and the people are like, what in the world is this? And so Moses is clear when he says here in verse 15, this is the bread which the Lord hath given you to eat. This is his special bread. And so Moses' response here to them is that this is the bread Jehovah had promised to rain down from heaven. And the text was clear earlier that this provision would show Israel, as we saw in verse 7, the glory of Jehovah. Again, verse 7. It says here, in the morning then shall ye see the glory of the Lord. So the thing that the people are like, what is it? Moses is like, this is the bread that Jehovah has provided. This is his glory that is demonstrated unto you. Now that concept itself might be difficult to understand at first, but I think the more we go through this, it'll make a little more sense. But this is an interesting statement considering that we do not necessarily see what the glory of Jehovah is as mentioned. And so think about all the different times in the text. We could do a survey of this. But all the different times it says, and the glory of the Lord appeared. Like, for example, we just got done with this last week, and when they see the pillar of the cloud, the glory of the Lord appeared in the cloud. So you can envision that something illuminated the cloud or something. And when they had the tabernacle, for example, the glory of the Lord descended upon it. It was a thick smoke. They could see. There's something visual there. When another time when it says the glory of the Lord appeared, it was like when they put the sacrifice in the altar, and then the tongue of fire comes out and licks up. It says they saw the glory of the Lord. And so there's many times when the glory of the Lord is connected in Scriptures, and people are said to have seen the glory of the Lord. Here we see the announcement ahead of time that they're going to see the glory of the Lord. Then we just have bread in the ground. And it's like we forget the connection that this demonstrated something from God and revealing his glory. Now we'll delve more into that. But it's very clear here that God is trying to make the connection. Here Israel's put a notice they'll see the glory of Jehovah in the morning, and thus here it is. So it's clear that this glory is the manna itself. That's all we have in the morning, is the manna from heaven. Now we have an interesting statement in Psalm 78 about this manna. You want to turn with me to Psalm 78 and look in verse 24. The reference to manna is mentioned a number of times in Scripture. Psalm 78. Take a look at verse 24. Psalm 78:24 says, "And he rained down manna upon them to eat." So here's this idea, the dew is the form of the raining coming down. "And had given them of the corn of heaven." So the corn here is like substance or grain. So basically, the inspired word here is saying is they received grain from heaven. And so there's this emphasis that this is food from God directly, from the heaven. Then in verse 25, "Man did eat angels' food. He sent them meat to the full," or meat is word for food. And so here we see this manna is referred to as angels' food. That's the extent of it right there, though, by the way. I mean, it's not like we get anything more. It's like, is this what angels eat? We're not told anything like that. But the idea is that this comes from the realm of the angels. This comes from the realm of God. This is heavenly food, is what this point is trying to make. And so when it says in Exodus 16 that God was going to give them food, rain down bread from heaven, it's literally from heaven. And second of all, it says they're going to see the glory of God. It is connected to the manna. Manna here is somehow showing forth the glory of God itself. And it's clear that this was a very special food. Also, if you take a look at Psalm 105. So go a little farther in Psalms, take a look at Psalm 105. And then Psalm 78 there talks about the quail, but that is more referring to the judgment of Numbers 11, if you read further there. Psalm 105, taking a look in verse 40. Psalm 105:40. It says, "The people asked, and he brought quails, and satisfied them with the bread of heaven." And so here we see this bread of heaven. It's interesting in this verse right here, it's almost like he's trying to say is that people were hungry, he provided quails, but it was the manna that truly satisfied them. It's almost like he's trying to say Psalm 105:40 again. The people asked, and he brought quails and satisfied them with the bread of heaven. So it's almost like he's trying to say is that you want true satisfaction, look for the actual true food that I provide you in what comes from the heavenly abode. What the text is bringing out is that being fed of manna is connected to seeing and experiencing Jehovah's glory. And so we see this connection here. Now, what's also interesting is that this daily ration of bread, this daily ration of manna, was meant to not only show them the glory of God, but also to teach them about the glory of God itself. Take a look at Deuteronomy chapter 8. This is what I referred to in my prayer. Deuteronomy chapter 8. And this is the very verse, or at least verse 3 is. We're going to read out, we're starting with verse 1 here. Is you think about the temptation in the wilderness that Yeshua had. Where he was in the wilderness 40 days and 40 nights, and then the devil came and tempted him. And the first thing the devil tempted him was to say, "Hey, you're so hungry, why don't you command these pieces of stone to turn to bread?" And what does Yeshua do? He goes back and quotes Deuteronomy 8 and verse 3. Let me read verse 1 to start with here, though. It says, "All the commandments which I command thee this day shall ye observe to do, that ye may live and multiply, and go in and possess the land which the Lord sware unto your fathers." So this is 40 years later, after they've had manna for 40 years. Verse 2, "And thou shalt remember all the way which the Lord thy God led thee these 40 years in the wilderness, to humble thee and to prove thee, to know what was in thine heart, whether thou wouldest keep his commandments or no." So again, we have another passage. I didn't bring this one out last week. We have another passage dealing with the proving is connected with whether or not they'll keep God's commandments or not. Then verse 3, he says, "And he humbled thee, and suffered thee," which is another word for allowed, "thee to hunger, and fed thee with manna, which thou knewest not, neither did thy fathers know, that he might make thee know that man doth not live by bread only, but by every word that proceedeth out of the mouth of the Lord doth man live." And so here we see in verse 3, that Jehovah allowed them to get hungry. So that's interesting in verse 3. And he humbled thee, and suffered thee, so allowed thee to hunger. So everything that happened when they entered the wilderness of sin was part of God's plan, part of his program. He purposely did not give them food. He purposely put them in the wilderness of sin in a position where they didn't have enough food, so they would get hungry so they could teach them a lesson. Again, verse 3, and he humbled thee and suffered thee to hunger, and fed thee with manna. So Jehovah allowed them to get hungry so he could feed them with the bread of heaven. Jehovah brought them to a point where they were forced to learn that they needed to rely upon Jehovah for the daily provision. But this was so that they would be physically dependent upon him. And so Jehovah wanted them to be physically dependent upon him every day, seeking him out, looking for him for their daily provision. But it wasn't necessarily so they could only just get physical nourishment, and so they learned to physically depend upon him every day. Rather, it was so Jehovah could use the physical to teach the spiritual. So again, we have this theme running through Scripture. Jehovah uses the physical to teach the spiritual. So when we read verse 3 again, Deuteronomy 8. And he humbled thee and suffered thee to hunger, and fed thee with manna, which thou knewest not, neither did thy fathers know, that he might make thee know that man doth not live by bread only, but by every word that proceedeth out of the mouth of the Lord doth man live. He gave them it daily so that man can learn they need to look to him daily for direction and instruction and nourishment. And so Jehovah was teaching the physical to learn the spiritual. And so when one looks to Jehovah every day for the physical and their spiritual needs, they see and encounter the glory of God. And so this kind of part of the aspect of it is God revealed his glory through the manna, but he also taught them about his glory by teaching them they need to look to him every day for nourishment, not only physical, but also spiritual. And so man then ends up seeing and encountering the glory of Jehovah. Now there's even more to it than this in seeing the glory of Jehovah in the manna. Because in John chapter 6, Jehovah compares himself to the manna that was provided in the Gospel of John in chapter 6. And we'll focus on this scripture in the second service. So we're not going to have you turn there now to John 6. I think most people remember this passage where Jehovah compares himself to the manna, and he basically says, you need to eat me. And so the different confusion that comes from that. So we'll deal with that today a little later. So back, though, to Exodus chapter 16. Let's turn back to Exodus 16. Pick it back up in verse 16. After Moses declares, this is the bread which the Lord hath given you to eat. It says this in verse 16, this is the thing which the Lord hath commanded. Gather of it every man according to his eating, an omer for every man according to the number of your persons. Take ye every man for them which are in his tents. So here Moses gives more instruction about the manna. The children of Israel are to go out and collect the manna from off the ground. So at this point here, remember, so God has declared that he's going to provide sustenance for them. He's going to provide food for them, bread in the morning, rain down bread from heaven. The next morning comes, the dew lifts off the ground, and there's this something all over the ground, and they said, what is it? They call it manna. At this point here, they haven't gathered any of it. They haven't tasted of it. They haven't taken of it yet. In verse 16, Jehovah commands through Moses to say, gather of it every man according to his eating, an omer for every man. According to the number of your persons, take ye every man for them which are in his tents. And so the children of Israel are to go out and collect the manna from off the ground. Each person or everyone is supposed to gather an omer according to the number of people in his household. So literally it has to do with skulls or heads of everyone in their tents. Now the text is not specifically defined an omer beyond what we have here in verse 16 and also in verse 36. If you look at the very end of the chapter, it says, now an omer is the 10th part of an ephah. Most of us would go, that's helpful, because we don't know what an ephah is. An ephah There's a wide variety here. Some say it's a little over 5 gallons of liquid. So you imagine like a 5-gallon jug that we have. Or it could be about a bushel and a 12th of a bushel, which means an omer might be anywhere between 1.5 to 3.5 quarts, which is a pretty wide range there. But there's some disagreement about what the size is. So you can think about a quart, which is about a half, there's 4 quarts in a gallon, right? So 1.5 quarts to 3.5 quarts, so almost a gallon. So think about it this way. Most equate an omer with the size of a good-sized bowl. So, like a small bowl, like a cereal bowl that we typically eat out of, but a larger bowl. But not like a huge mixing bowl. So think about something smaller than a gallon, but larger than like a small bowl. So like a medium-sized kind of bowl type of thing. So basically they go out with, to collect this. So whether it is in their garment, they lift up or whatever and collect it in, or they have some sort of container. The text doesn't say, but they're basically supposed to gather about an omer's worth of this manna. What the text seems to indicate here in verse 16 is that an omer is the amount that is about the right amount for you to eat for a day of food that would satisfy you for a day's worth of provision. The exact amount will be different for each person. And this is brought out in the next 2 verses. So we move on to verse 17. So verse 17. And the children of Israel did sow and gathered, some more, some less. And when they did meet it with an omer, or measure with an omer, he that gathered much had nothing left over. And he that gathered little had no lack. They gathered every man according to his eating. And so it's like people went out, and so it says here, the children of Israel did so and gathered some more and some less. So in other words, they didn't really have an exact measuring. But each person went out into the wilderness, out of their surroundings, and gathered up. And when they came back and they kind of compared, how much did you grab? How much did you grab? And they can measure versus an omer, some a little bit more, some a little bit less. But as it says here, verse 18 is key. It says that, and when they did meet it with an omer, he that gathered much had nothing left over. And he that gathered little had no lack. They gathered every man according to his eating. So that these verses are not saying that he that was lazy ended up with enough to eat. That's not what this is saying. So it's saying that, one person went out and just got a handful, and he was satisfied. And it's also not saying that he that was overzealous did not have too much. Rather, what this is saying is that when each person took as much as they thought they would need to eat, it turned out that they had exactly the right amount. That's what it's trying to say. That when you went out and you gathered an omer, that you gathered enough, that you had enough. So let me read those verses again, verse 17 and 18. And the children of Israel did sow and gathered, some more, some less. And what were they supposed to gather? Well, verse 16. This is the thing which the Lord hath commanded. Gather of it every man according to his eating. An omer for every man. So the Lord's trying to say, hey, you need about an omer. Go out there and gather how much you think you're going to need to eat. And what happened? Verse 17. The children of Israel did so and gathered, some more, some less. And then verse 18 clarifies, and when they did meet it with an omer, he that gathered much, or in other words, more than an omer, had nothing over. And he that gathered little had no lack. They gathered every man according to his eating. So this says here that he that gathered more than an omer had gathered more than his eating. Gathered more, and he had what he needed. Nothing was left over. He had what he needed according to his eating. He that gathered a little less still had enough because he gathered according to his eating. It turns out that it turned out that they had exactly the right amount. It's like the text is saying that Jehovah provided perfect satisfaction consistent with the intent of the person. When they went out and took as much as they thought they would need to eat, if they took too much over an omer, it was just the right amount. They had nothing left over. If the person gathered a little less, they weren't a little hungry because they didn't gather the quite omer. Because they gathered what they thought they needed, God provided. satisfaction in the amount they had. They didn't have any left over. They didn't need any more. In other words, if the gatherer desired to get the right amount to satisfy them, Jehovah would make it so the gathered amount matched their desire. It is actually a very interesting concept that emerges here. It's like the spiritual connection to the reality that manifests itself. So in other words, if a person went out to the wilderness and said, I'm going to obey God, and I'm going to gather just enough for me to be satisfied what I need to eat, well, God's going to cause them to gather a little more or less than an omer, and then when they eat it all, they're going to find out they have the exact amount that satisfies them. Not too much, not too little. Even though one person might have more or less, because they went out there and they gathered in obedience to God to how much they thought they needed to eat. And God then made it so whatever they gathered was the perfect amount to satisfy them. This is important. You don't miss this point that I'm making right now. It's like there's a spiritual connection here to their desire to be obedient. That God satisfies them physically to match up with their spiritual desire to obey God. This may not make sense until we get to the next verse. Let's move on to the next verse. Verse 19. And Moses said, let no man leave of it till the morning. Let no man leave of it till the morning. So here Moses gives the instruction about the manna. That whatever was gathered for that day was not to be left until the next morning. So remember the manna came in the morning when the dew lifted, and the sun came out, the dew lifted up, manna was there, they were to gather it. And then Moses says here, don't let any of the manna that you gather that morning remain until the next morning. In other words, you need to eat the whole thing up before the next morning. So you don't need to eat it in the morning. You don't have to eat it in the afternoon. You don't have to eat it even when the sun goes down. But just make sure it's all gone before the next morning, is what he's trying to say here. He's kind of saying you have like about 24 hours to eat it, maybe about 20 hours to eat this stuff. So whatever they took, they were expected to eat before the next morning. And so this is where the clean plate concept comes from originally. You don't think about that. So you eat everything on your plate, right? Take what you can eat. So it's kind of the clean plate theory that God is saying here. Make sure you eat everything. One of the interesting things that kind of comes along as a side note, I don't know how much to read into this, is we see a connection here to Passover. Because the last time we heard about this, don't let any of it reside until the morning, or you need to burn up what happens in the morning, is what? The Passover lamb. And so we have this concept kind of coming in here with the provision of Jehovah. Now it's important to see this verse in light of the two previous verses. Because Moses says here in verse 19, let no man leave of it till the morning. This is a curious statement because what did we just read in verses 17 and 18? Let me read those again. 17 and 18. The children of Israel did so and gathered some more and some less. And when they did meet it with an omer, he that gathered much had nothing over. And he that gathered little had no lack. They gathered every man according to his eating. So here you have verses 17 and 18 state there was not too much or too little to those that gathered according to his eating. So if everybody took what they needed to eat, why would there be any left over? Why would Moses give the instruction here? Think about this. So don't read too quickly through the text. Ask yourself questions here. Why would you need this instruction if God just got done saying everyone that went out and gathered according to his eating had exactly the right amount? Even for those that gathered over the omer and under the omer. Why is it then that Moses gives the instruction? Well, there's one or two possible scenarios here. One is individuals took just the right amount as they're supposed to, but then they didn't eat it all. In other words, they didn't get full satisfaction because they were worried they would not have enough provision for the next day. So even though they took the right amount and they could have eaten it all, they didn't because they were worried about what was going to happen the next day. In other words, they were rationing it. So that's one possible scenario. And as a consequence, if they didn't eat everything, that means they wouldn't be fully satisfied because they're not trusting God. Think about the spiritual connection to this. If you're not taking everything God wants, you're not eating it all, you're not relying upon Him, you're not fully satisfied. Because they had gathered the exact amount to be satisfied, they didn't eat it all. Now, the second scenario would be is that some individuals took more than they thought they would need. So in other words, when they went and they gathered, they didn't go, oh, let me just take as much as I need to eat for this daily provision. They took more. So God enabled those individuals that wanted to take the right amount, he enabled them to take the right amount. But if an individual said, I want to take more, God wouldn't hold them back. And to say, oh, you want more than your daily eating, I'm going to hold you back and only let you take what you can eat today. And so I think part of the connection that we read back in 17 and 18 is that those that went out to the wilderness to gather according to what God instructed to say, only take what you need for today's provision, God enabled them to only bring back what they would need. Some more than an omer, some less than an omer. However, there's individuals that took above and beyond and took more, and then God wouldn't stop them. So they took more just in case. Just in case, well, there wouldn't be stuff for tomorrow, the next day. Remember, Jehovah said to only take what they needed for that day. And then Jehovah would make it so that they had the amount that matched their desire. So if your desire was to take more, God would allow you to take more. If your desire was to take only what you needed for that day, Jehovah would allow you to take just what you gather that amount. And what was the result that would take more than their desire for a day? Well, they would have more than what they needed then. In other words, if you took more than you could eat, well, then you would reach your full, and you'd have stuff left over because God would be like, you're too full. It's kind of like, for example, when you have that 15 pizza. At a certain point, you're like, I just can't physically eat any more pizza because I had too much to eat. So if you took too much and then you receive the instruction, imagine you're like, well, I'm going to take a whole bunch of pizza. And you have a whole plate full of it. And the instruction then came from your mother to say, you need to eat every single bit that's on your plate. And you had you're trying to get that last piece done. You're like, oh, I can't eat anymore. Well, just like these people here that go out in the wilderness and God says, take only what you can eat. And they bring back more. And then Moses says in the verse here in verse 19, he says, let no man leave it till the morning. You're like, oh no, what am I going to do now? Moses here warns. Now we get verse 20. Notwithstanding, they hearkened not unto Moses. But some of them left of it until the morning, and it bred worms and stank. And Moses was wroth with them. So here we find the consequence of not heeding the warning to leave none until the next day. Any manna left over brought forth worms, and it stunk. Both aspects would make the manna inedible. You think about it, if you look down in your food and there's worms coming out, you're probably not going to eat it anymore. Because you're like, that's worms in that thing. Also, if it stunk really bad, you typically start getting close to your face, you're like, oh, I can't eat this, it smells terrible, right? So you're not going to go plug your nose and eat if it smells super bad, and you see worms coming out of this thing. So both aspects would make the manna inedible. It would look disgusting with worms moving around in it, and of course, the smell would be off-putting. But there would be another consequence to the bad smell. It would tell everyone else around, those individuals that disobeyed, that they did not obey. You think about this. If you obeyed and you didn't leave any of your manna, but you could smell something really terrible come from the next tent over, you're like, oh, I guess they didn't listen to Moses, did they? They disobeyed. So it'd be almost be like an alarm bell going off, disobeyer, 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 over here. And so as Moses walks through the camp, he can smell this stench. What's this telling? People didn't listen. So the dwelling place of the disobedient would stink like rotten manna. Everyone else would know. And so we see here that Moses was wroth with them. Not only because they disobeyed, but because they made the camp stink up. It was a terrible smelling area. So what this would have done would have caused everyone to quickly get in line with only gathering the amount of manna that they would expect to be able to eat. So if you have this happen one day, and the next day, people quickly realize, I'm not going to be the person that's smelling this place up, and I want to make sure that everything's staying nice around here, and only going to take that which I can eat for that day, because I don't want this stuff to go bad. What are we going to do with this stuff? It just reeks. And so, I'm not sure, the text doesn't give us indication of how many had to learn the lesson, but it says there in verse 20, it says, notwithstanding, they hearkened not unto Moses, but some of them left of it until the morning. So not all of them, but some of them. And we see the consequence. It bred worms and it stank. Verse 21. This will be our last verse here for the day. And they gathered it every morning, every man according to his eating. And when the sun waxed hot, it melted. So here we see that the Israelites quickly learned the routine and only gathered the amount of manna that they needed. And we also find another detail here, that when the sun waxed hot, the manna melted. So this likely refers to the noon or slightly around that time, the noon time, when the sun comes up in the sky, it's super hot. So you can think about the dew typically leaves well before noon, before it gets super hot, but a period of time afterwards. So this tells us that the manna was only available for gathering during a certain portion of the day. It doesn't mean that any of the manna you had left in the bowls or whatever else containers, it melted in the bowls as the heat of the day. Because obviously that was the case, then there'd be nothing ever left over for the morning of the next day. So this tells us it's referring to the manna that's on the ground. So it tells them that it would not appear until after the sun caused the dew to evaporate, but it would only remain until the sun got really hot during the day. And when it did, the manna would melt away or disintegrate, kind of go to nothing. In other words, they could no longer collect it after a certain point. So there was a limitation on the time that it could be collected. This time selection is interesting because it's like Jehovah was only allowing the people to collect it when it would be comfortable for them to collect it. Think about the best time of the day to be out there collecting the manna would be during the morning hours. When's the worst time to be out there doing jobs in the summertime? After the heat of the sun goes up in the air, right? Way up there. So it seems to be another blessing associated with obedience. But also connected to this time frame is the truth that one that needs to obey within a time frame designated. So think about this. Jehovah's trying to say, you need to obey me, but you need to obey me within a certain time frame. In other words, if you try to obey me outside this time frame, it's not going to work for you. Obedience is timely, is what he's trying to teach here. So the truth is that one needs to obey within the time frame that's designated, or there'll be no provision or blessing. In other words, if you go out looking for manna outside the designated time frame, you're going to find no provision. You're going to find no blessing. And this is how it works many times with Jehovah's instructions. He gives instructions that have parameters. You need to obey when he says to do something within the parameters he gives you. He expects us to carry out what he's instructed within those parameters. When we do not do this, we find that the associated blessing for obedience is no longer there. Think about how many times people go, well, yeah, I did obey, eventually, but there's no blessing. God didn't keep his word. He didn't keep his promise. Well, the reality is if you don't obey within the time period he tells you to obey, the blessing disappears. The provision disappears. The nourishment's no longer there. So it's like Jehovah's trying to teach his people to be consistent and to be prompt in obedience. That when they do so, he will provide for them. But they need to obey or it will not work out. So we see here as we move through chapter 16, the manna is provided and the glory of God, the provision is provided for them. Let's go ahead and let's close in prayer. We'll finish up the chapter, Lord willing, next week. Heavenly Father.